the chair of this panel, and I see a lot of students coming, which makes us always happy to have very much student-oriented discussion. Let me start by introducing the topic. It's the way ahead, priorities for advancing the common good in the development agenda. It's always to have such a final panel, to look into the future and to think about what will happen in 2030, or how optimistic or skeptical we can be. The talks about future are interesting because somehow they also give us this opportunity to link what Richard Falk described as three horizons: the horizon of necessity, the horizon of feasibility, and the horizon of desire. And somehow detaching ourselves from the issues of today and the numbers and the data and think ahead always helps us to make the balance between the aspirations, what definitely SDGs is about, and the feasibility and the reality. So how aspirational are the SDGs? Which of them will be achieved? Which will not be achieved? Why? What needs to be done? What is feasible? Often we see the word eradication or the number 0 in the goals and in the targets and indicators. How feasible is number 0? Can we zero the poverty or the discrimination? All of those questions I hope the panelists will address, and we have plenty of them. Let me start by introducing the first one. Somebody doesn't need introduction. Mike Davis is our professor in law and international affairs at the Jindal Global Law School, somebody you know already very well, so I will give him the floor in a minute. We have a very distinguished guest, Dr. Mithu Sengupta, Associate Professor from Ryerson University of Toronto, Canada. Thank you very much for making the journey all over Canada to us and to be with us today. We are very privileged to have such speaker from such family, and we are very much looking forward to interact with you. We have Trinanjan, our program officer in the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. Kaveri is somewhere there with her students. She will present together with 4 of her students in a few minutes. And Professor Dipanshu, which I don't see, he should be with us. And this is really something we need to take seriously, how people can come from Canada on time, but somebody who is in this building is not on time. So please, I appeal to the registrar to take seriously those issues when our own faculty turn late. And we have. But okay, let's start with Mike Davis, please.
Okay, thank you, Veselin. I was just asked to do this yesterday before I went into 2 of my classes all day until 9 o'clock last night. Well, I can promise you I didn't stay up all night and prepare, so I'm kind of winging it a bit. Talk about something that concerns me. When much of the conversation over these issues in this conference is sort of looking at, well, we've got governments and now we're trying to do things. So we're trying to ask, well, how we can bring things to the grassroots level. But one of the things that has concerned me a lot, and I've written some about it time to time, is that, let's say 20 years ago, we built democracies across Asia, and there was a lot of hope about being able to address issues and develop inclusive processes and so on. Well, what I would say today is most of those democracies are now in crisis across the region. In some ways, India is a bright spot. The democracy of India is not under threat. It's more facing challenges like corruption and things that would undermine trying to achieve what we're talking about here in this conference, or all kinds of other problems in that regard. But sort of in a sort of basic institutional level, it's surviving okay. Let me see, I'm getting this. But it's not the case in much of the rest of Asia, that we have problems in Asia. One is the constitutional systems that people envisioned would be liberal ones, much like India has, with functioning courts, independent institutions that can function, and efforts within that framework of free speech, protection, and so on, to include people, to include the voice of people, including poor people. But many of those democracies haven't delivered very well. The democracy gets undermined by populism and expediency and corruption, enforcement of rights by the lack of judicial independence or institutional autonomy, and again corruption, basic rights of speech, labor, economic equality, rights relating to poverty and the environment are ignored by those emerging democracies. Discrimination is rampant based on gender, children's rights, minority rights. There are structural deficits in many of the democracies across the region around issues of separation of powers, human rights commissions. There's like 15 of them across our Asian region, but very few of them would really pass a test for functioning autonomously. Federalism regimes have been set up, but are often undermined by problems of, again, respect for local institutions, fears of governments, local governments or autonomous governments seeking independence, trying to bail out of the country. So the result is a state of crisis exists. If you look around the Asian region and look at countries that are under constitutional stress, in East Asia would include Mongolia. Hong Kong is a region that has that. South Korea has gone through some recent crisis with the leadership charged with corruption. In Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, all suffering from constitutional crisis of one form or another. In South Asia, the Maldives, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, the list is horribly long. It's not unique to Asia. We know, we've seen the Arab Spring and all of that. And so these kinds of problems go around the world. Even scholars are now pointing out that in the West, liberal democracy is under threat. Recent opinion poll that was published in the Journal of Democracy pointed out among millennials in Western countries and the US, 17% think military rule would be better than democracy. I mean, it's really scary. What's happened is a previous generation may have grown up with the Cold War and, the Soviet Union versus freedom or open societies, and maybe have some clear sense that one thing was better than the other. But the young people today may not have that. So that's a problem worldwide. But I think in Asia, the list of constitutional crises is something that is very worrisome. And if you think about that and you're thinking about how your government, whether the democracy will survive all of this and be able to deliver. I mean, once you say that you want autonomous institutions to deliver these sustainable development goals, then the question is whether you have such institutions. And so what does this constitutional crisis across the region represent to that effort? I think, one argument might be, well, authoritarian regimes, China delivers, so, it's doing better. It's one of the main achievers, shall we say, of the Millennium Development Goals. But I think I kind of dismiss that. I think a country like that, an authoritarian regime, tends to deliver to a point, but in many ways it becomes its own gravedigger. As the society becomes more successful, then it faces very deep challenges of corruption and mass concerns with basic rights, basic human rights, that may not have been prevalent when the country was sort of a basket case, as China was after the end of the Cultural Revolution. So is that country now at a point where it has to transition? But my bigger concern is even the countries that are claiming to be or aspiring to be democracies, if their government's failing, then how are they going to deliver on these kinds of objectives? And here in India, again, well, I don't think that the constitutional system of India is under that level of stress. It is under stress by problems of corruption and the inability to deliver. So I guess I'm saying we're not going to find an easy fix. Socialism, Marxism maybe thought it had an easy fix, but it was just the race to the bottom for those countries. So we're going to be trying to function within some version of a liberal democracy, and so the work is going to have to take place in that context. But if we lose that, that's a problem. Just a couple examples, like Thailand. Thailand had some, it was really one of the bright spots in Southeast Asia. It had democracy, had been established, the leaders were elected. For years, it used to be a common joke, a sad joke, that the way to change government in Thailand was by coup d'etat, right? But then finally, they had established a democracy, and things were going well. And again, there were problems with drugs and this and that, and a bit of corruption. And so you get a populist leader, Shinawatra, a few years ago, and he's claiming he'll solve all these problems and lead them to the promised land. And that road is a very dangerous road. He went down that road, and we know what happened. First one coup d'etat, and then another attempt to establish it under his sister, and another coup d'etat. And now the country is basically under military rule. And it's got a new constitution drafted, but we don't know where that's going to go. And if we're looking at this line of constitutional crisis and whether we're going to have governments that can deliver on the kinds of things we want, we can add to the list the Philippines. Here again, now it's like the Philippines is following the Thai model, right? Theirs was Shinawatra, now we got Duterte. And he's essentially claiming to do all the same thing, shoot the drug dealers, deal with things pretty much by a form of government we'd call expediency. Now, it would be great if expedient government was able to lift everybody up and solve all the problems. What it does instead is it causes people to have no confidence in the system. And so when you're talking about economic development, you want a system of government that at least inspires some confidence, that allows people locally to invest their lives in what's going on, in your goals and your plans for the society, and at the same time, outsiders, because development requires outside confidence and investment as well. So what you have in the Philippines today, not just a breakdown, the poverty remains, the crime problem now is handled by vigilante justice and poor governance, and that's sort of where it's at the moment. And where is this going to lead the country? One can only imagine. Of course, closer to India is Myanmar. Here again, the people are sort of left governance-wise, either some kind of military rule or they can try to maintain a democracy. If they get military rule, don't bet a lot of money that you're going to have inclusive politics, And Myanmar is sort of pivoted on the edge of that. We know they held elections, but they've come up with constitutional models that essentially guarantees the military will have all the power. And we see this with the Rohingya crisis, is right in the news recently. The government really has little control over that. We'd like Aung San Suu Kyi to find her voice, at least to say something, but politically that's dangerous for her. But she has no control over defense, home affairs, or even over the National Security Agency in the country. So if constitutionalism is in crisis in this country, in these countries, and many others, you can add to the list the Maldives. You can wonder whether Sri Lanka is going to keep going sort of on a path that will allow it to have good governance, and so on. So I think we have to pay attention to these things along with these more grassroots kinds of strategies. Autonomous regimes, that's one big problem in the region. If you're talking about ethnic minority groups, often one of the solutions is to provide autonomy. Does the autonomy regime work? We call it it can be either an asymmetric federalism, which allows differences to occur to acknowledge local concerns and so on, or some kind of autonomy regime. But these regimes often collapse, of course, under authoritarianism in China. Hong Kong and Tibet know that autonomy is very fragile, right? How it works in India, you guys would know better than I do. But it often, it's interesting, at the end of World War II, the UN Charter imagined that future wars would be countries attacking each other. But most of the wars that occurred after World War II have been insurgent wars arising within countries. So this kind of security dilemma also poses a challenge to trying to have orderly processes to address goals such as the ones we want to talk about here. And again, inclusive politics. I personally have written a sort of list of things that I think are important when we're building democracy, and a lot of these countries are emerging democracies. I won't go through the whole list here, but I would just say that the sort of the fundamental part is, as you're building democracy, to have processes of inclusion. And it's interesting, I think this was one of India's successes. We had a speaker here recently who pointed out that Indians became voters before they became citizens, that there was a mobilization of electoral engagement in India back in the 40s when this project began that seemed to be sustained, even to this day, a very high level of participation in politics. And that offers hope. Even poor people in India participate in politics. So I think there's a lot of hope in that. But I think if we look at this problem and the topic broadly across our region, there's a lot of dangers on the horizon that we should be concerned about. And I'm just posing one of them, and that is the state of crisis of democracy in our region. And I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for bringing this important angle into the discussion. Indeed, peace and security, democracy, and human rights are very relevant to development. And in fact, SDG reflected on the lack. What MDG did not do was to make that focus on accountable institution and on peace and security and rule of law. And looking ahead, I guess that's one way to think about it. It's not only to look at the numbers and economics and mathematics, but also to look at broader values, as you mentioned, inclusivity, democracy, civil and political rights, not only economic and social and cultural rights. So let's move to our special guest for this panel, let's put it this way, Dr. Mitu Sengupta, and her presentation on the 2030 Agenda Priority Challenges and Way Forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm just going to see if this is flipping. Okay, so the title of the session is Way Ahead, Priorities for Advancing the Common Good and the Development Agenda. And I wanted to bring it back to the SDGs and how, the SDGs, what we can learn from the SDGs in terms of establishing priorities and charting out the path forward. And you'll see that there are challenges and also a lot of potential possibilities there. So just to recap, and I apologize for not being here yesterday because maybe some of you you covered a lot of ground, and this is a little bit of a recap. So Agenda 2030 centerpiece is really the Sustainable Development Goals, and not to read over all of them, but here they are. There's 17, and I think there are about 169 targets, so it's a very big encompassing agenda. Now, a couple of things I want to say, and this came up in the last session when someone said, I think someone asked whether this was a legally binding instrument. Well, that was on the table as a point of discussion when the MDGs replacement debates were going on, that what was going to replace the MDGs, and it was decided that the SDGs would replace the MDGs and they would not be a legally binding instrument like the MDGs, that they would be voluntary. And Jeffrey Sachs was somebody who was quite instrumental here, and he made a very good argument that when you have a legally binding instrument, it is necessarily more restrictive because you have to get all the UN member states on board, and so they would end up with a much more restrictive agenda. And having a voluntary agreement allows you to have this broad, encompassing, ambitious agenda, and that was the idea behind the SDGs, to have this kind of inspirational text that would set global standards and that would be very ambitious in scope. And with all the understanding that this was not going to be legally binding and that it would be left up to the states, national governments to implement this agenda. So I want to look at 5 key lessons that are conveyed by the SDGs and how they may help us set priorities and chart the way forward. So 5 key lessons, and this is taking the SDGs as an inspirational text. That's what they're meant to do. So, this is kind of casting the SDGs in a bit of a positive light, and I'll go to the negative light soon enough. So the first lesson is poverty, hunger, ill health, and so on are complex, multidimensional problems that can neither be measured nor solved by one policy instrument or approach alone. And this is actually quite revolutionary, especially with the flagship poverty goal. Poverty was, traditionally has been measured or seen as really a material deprivation, a lack of income, and over time we've come to recognize poverty in all its multidimensionality. There are all these multidimensional approaches to measuring poverty, and you can really see this in the goal, reflected in the goal here, that if you want to end poverty, you have to do more than raise incomes. You have to, so you have things like what's mentioned here, build resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations to climate change, and then give people access to basic services, ownership, control over land and other forms of property. So all of these other issues are brought on the table by the SDGs, and it's a recognition that poverty is multidimensional. So that's one thing, but of course with all the other goals also you see this. You see a very comprehensive approach. The health goal is another one, which has a very comprehensive approach, which is inspired by the social determinants of health approach. So, health is not just seen as a problem that can be solved by better health care or better medicines, but by all kinds of interventions at the social level, and including inequality, eliminating inequality. That's seen as something that is causing this kind of health disparities. And so it does give you this idea, and for policymakers, this is an important thing to understand and learn, and whether or not in India this is happening is a question maybe we can put on the table. What is the approach to poverty reduction? Is it this integrated, multidimensional approach? But certainly that's something that the SDGs are inspiring us to do. Secondly, the second lesson is that poverty, climate change, gender inequality, and other problems are related to one another, so they can't be seen just in silos. And you actually see this in all the goals again, where you see challenges are addressed not only through standalone goals, so you have this goal on climate change, goal 13, but climate change targets appear in all the other goals as well, most of the other goals. So if I flip back to this one, on poverty, you'll see that 1.5 is directly related to climate change. So what they're conveying, the lesson that they're conveying here is that if you want to do something about climate change, it's not something that you can just address, by focusing on this problem alone, but you have to integrate and see how it's interconnected to all these other concerns. And in that sense, the SDGs really capture this interconnectedness of sustainable development concerns. And again, for policymakers, this is an important lesson and an important point to reflect upon, that we need to take this comprehensive, integrated approach to all of these development problems. Okay, so moving on. This is an important one as well. A lesson is poverty, hunger, ill health, and so on are problems that have relevance for both developing and developed countries. This is a one world agenda, so the SDGs have been promoted as this one world universal agenda that is applicable to everyone, everywhere. And that developed countries are asked to really take ownership of the agenda, whereas the MDGs were often read as sort of a slate of instructions for developing countries alone. That it was all about them, it was nothing about us. So this is something that they've tried anyway to do, and you can see this in the health goal specifically, because you have certain targets in the health goal that are highly applicable to developed countries. The point about 3.4, you can see non-communicable diseases, NCDs, which are cancer, heart disease, and so on, which are very prevalent in developed countries. So there's a mention of that. There's a mention of mental health and well-being, narcotic drug abuse, harmful use of alcohol. And again, as I said, going back to an earlier point, it really is quite a comprehensive view of health and what needs to be done to achieve health and well-being, ensure healthy lives, and promote well-being for all. And there's even one target on road accidents. that's also then seen as, like the civil engineering is also part of the puzzle. You need better roads if you want to have better health and well-being. So it is quite this sort of comprehensive, integrated approach to development. Okay. The fourth point is, the fourth lesson rather, is that we must strive to end rather than only reduce certain problems that we can say are morally wrong, such as extreme poverty and hunger. And this is actually a very powerful statement. So you're changing the language. You're talking about eradication, ending. So I've given 3 examples here. There are a few more as well through the agenda. One is on the poverty, another one on ending forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere, and zero hunger, ending hunger. So this is a powerful message to agents, whether they be national governments or international aid agencies, that we need to end these problems. So we need to do whatever we can to mobilize resources in order to make this happen. And so the zero hunger, there's a lot of talk actually on the zero hunger point about how to achieve zero hunger, and you can see that there are lots of things that are being proposed, including increasing productivity for smallholders, reducing waste. So this has started this conversation about how this can be achieved. And it obviously is a colossal challenge because a lot of resources will have to be mobilized in order to achieve this kind of, zero goals. The fifth point, or the fifth lesson, and this was also alluded to, I think, Steve, you mentioned this about disaggregating disaggregating indicators rather. The fifth lesson, and this is an important one I think for policymakers, especially in India, to take note of, is that we must strive to leave no one behind. Okay, which means that, and the SDGs make it very clear that targets will not be considered achieved only if they're met for all segments of the population. Targets will be considered achieved only if they are met for all segments of a population, especially those who are subject to discrimination on grounds prohibited in international human rights law. So for example, in Canada, I can give an example from Canada, my sort of second home country, is that Canada is a very affluent country and it does well on most indicators. But there's a very big difference between most of the population and those who live on indigenous reserves. And so this has been discussed in Canada, that although we are meeting all the targets without any problem, they're not met for the indigenous populations. And so has Canada met the targets? No, it hasn't, because it hasn't met the target for everybody. So this is something to really, that I think governments really need to take heed of, if they, and this is something that the SDGs are really kind of guiding them towards. And of course, in India, we have huge problems in this regard. It's a very political issue, as you can imagine. Like disaggregating indicators is exposing yourself in a sense, because that's exactly what most governments don't want to do. They want to say, oh, we've met them because we have this model village, you can visit it, or it's met in Delhi. But of course it's not, and there's all this like large-scale deprivation, pockets of deprivation in even the most advanced industrialized countries, and so in India that would be huge as well. And so here I've got a little chart of who's at risk of being left behind. So women from disadvantaged ethnic groups, I would say people from racialized or communities and disadvantaged ethnic groups in general, children as well, people with disabilities. So the SDGs have shone the light on people with disabilities in that sense, because they are named as a category of people who need that kind of special attention. And also LGBTQ, the gay and lesbian community as well, who are also face lots of discrimination, and they may be left behind as well. So these are the 5 important lessons, and that I sort of gleaned. I mean, you could add to this about what the SDGs are really kind of inspiring or providing this kind of inspiration to change our ways, in terms of, not paying attention to who is left behind, making sure that we look at problems like poverty and health and ill health and so on in a multidimensional way, and that we measure it in this kind of redevelop multidimensional measures. Of course, these are huge challenges, okay, so they're huge challenges, and here we come to some of the problems now, because what the SDGs don't do, so I'll give you four points here, and there could be more, so we can discuss that in the discussion period. One is that no clear pathway is provided for achieving the goals and for addressing conflicts and potential trade-offs. Now, this was also deliberate, so this is not an accident that this has happened in the SDGs, that the SDGs do not give you, kind of a direct path, because that would have been, again, very difficult to pass through the UN and with lots of objections. So this was seen as, there was a clear sort of decision to look at the ends of development and leave the kind of pathways and so on for governments to work out for themselves. But this has also been a point where people have been very critical of the goals and saying that, well, maybe more of an effort should have been made. In fact, there are means of implementation attached to each goal. They're very vague, they're not very directive. So there is a little bit of an effort to do that, but they kind of pulled back in terms of really giving any real direction. So one of the problems with the SDGs is that there's a temptation as a result for governments to just cherry pick whatever they feel like. There's an enormous list, 169 indicators, targets. You just cherry pick what you think you can achieve quickly. In fact, Radhika was showing that chart of the NITI Aayog, and there was this chart of the different schemes and the different targets and goals. And what I noticed, I looked at that before in my research, and so what the government has been doing is just slotting existing schemes under targets. So they're not really picking new schemes. I mean, they're just sort of, oh, here is one scheme we have, and it kind of fits under this, so we'll put it there, and then that will look like we're sort of on our way to achieving this. So there is this temptation, and we have to watch for that. And there's a lot of and then all the monitoring and so on is also a huge problem. But I'll get to that in a moment. The second point also I think is really important, and it also has come up in the previous session, that there's no clear indication given of who should be doing what to achieve the goals. Crucially, no concrete responsibilities are assigned to the world's most powerful agents, who ideally should be taking the lead in providing resources. Now, in human rights language, as you would know, you have to have someone who has a duty or a responsibility, the duty bearers. And who are the duty bearers? We don't know. We don't really know. It's not specific. It looks like it's the national government, but then they also mention the private sector. They're the aid agencies. They're developed country governments. So it's, this is not really worked out. And then again, the alert I've given is that there's a temptation then to evade one's own responsibilities, pass the buck, and say, which is happening, say, well, we could have achieved this, but we don't have the resources. Only if we had aid, or only if we had more assistance. Or, developed country governments would say that, well, we are not going to give aid because these national governments are so corrupt. So why should we, it's their responsibility. So is this passing the buck? And given the enormity of the task, I mean, in a sense, the SDG set out this enormously ambitious agenda. We need huge amounts of resources to be able to achieve that. And then we have this very weak kind of implementation mechanism, and especially a very weak accountability structure. So this is really an accountability problem, that we don't know who's accountable for what. Okay. Then, for the third point, third criticism and challenge is that there are a lot of structural and systemic reforms that are needed to tackle problems such as poverty or to end poverty. And these are not explicitly mentioned, okay? So for example, there's no reference to debt cancellation in the SDGs. This was a demand of developing countries blocks of developing countries in the SDG negotiations, but it didn't go through. So this is, I mean, we do have to recognize that the SDGs are politically negotiated, agreement. You won't get everything in, but this is quite a problem. And again, as a result, so if you want to end poverty, end hunger, reduce inequality dramatically, you need systemic changes. You need changes in the way things are done in the global order. You need changes to the global institutional order. And how, this is completely not left off the table. It's not even named. And, one thing one can say about the SDGs is their greatest strength is to name issues. Like, really, that's what the SDGs are for. The SDGs are to inspire, but they're also to name problems so that they're put on the global agenda, that, yes, this is a problem, and that is a problem. And if they're failing to name it, that's a pretty big failing. Then the last point that I'll mention here is that there's a slew of nationally determinable targets, such as SDG 1.3, calling for nationally appropriate social protection measures, respecting policies, national policy space, and these are meant to provide developing country governments with flexibility. Now, I want to just give you some background to this. So this is also something that the developing countries negotiated for, because they were worried that, like the MDGs, the MDGs were actually quite punitive on the poorest countries. Why is that? Think of it this way. So if you have to have poverty, okay, and you are a country that's very poor and has a huge number of people who are living in extreme poverty, having poverty is a monumental task. If you're living in a country like Canada, or even a lower-middle-income country like Mexico, the number of poor in your country is less, right? So having is a less monumental task. So what the MDGs were ironically doing is really punishing and being really critical of the poorest countries. And so developing countries want to avoid this kind of scenario where the ones who are the poorest would be the most shamed. So they were pushing for this and saying, we need flexibility so that we can determine our own targets. But they were saying that we can actually we can agree to not having these if developed countries commit more resources explicitly. But it has to be a give and take. It's not that developed countries will not commit resources and they will also give us these universal standards. So this was the compromise, that developed countries did not want to commit the resources explicitly. They didn't want to be named as responsible agents or the agents with more responsibility. So the compromise was that you have these, nationally appropriate, this language around nationally appropriate social protection measures and so on. Now, the danger, of course, here, as you can imagine, is that governments will just say, well, we can't do this because we don't have the resources. This is not nationally appropriate. This is not a standard we can meet. And so we have a real danger then of undermining the, universal goals and especially the zero goals. Because a country like India can actually say at the end and kind of get off the hook by saying, well, we don't have the resources to do it. Okay, and so there isn't enough of a push from the agenda to say, well, actually, you have to do it. You have to move around your resources. You have to do it, and then we can help, like the more developed countries and aid agencies and so on. So these are some of the challenges. I think I think it'd be nice to talk about. Like, I'm sure some of you will now talk about what specifically, is going on in India, and in the last session also, that there's a lot of lag. There's already almost 2 years, and as I said, I mean, I've been working on the SDGs for a while, and especially on India, and looking at the charting of the Niti Aayog. As I said, that's what it seems to me that's what they're doing, although there is, there are other schemes that are coming up. There are lots of other challenges, of course, like monitoring and review, and this has been also mentioned in the last session, so we can, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr.